more questions. Well, this one is it's kind of a sad question, actually. A title of Sad Science. And this is something that happens to me every time I watch a Disney movie. But why do your eyes produce tears when we cry?
Yeah,
Sam?
it's a great question.
Why
It's
does-
not sad at all. It's super interesting science. Okay, so our eyes, I guess I'll start by saying our eyes don't only produce tears when we cry, right? So everybody has experiences where their eyes water, right? And so we do tend to think of like the emotional response tears. We tend to call those like, that's crying. The other kind of tears, like tearing up just from like irritation or something, the technical term for that would be lacrimation. So there are three kinds of tears that exist. Scientists sort of divide tears into three different categories. So you can have what are called, or lacrimation, I should say. You can have what's called basal lacrimation or basal tears. Basal tears are just sort of the basic moisture that the tear glands, and actually let me show you really quickly, if we could jump to my screen. This is sort of a diagram showing the lacrimal gland up here. This is the gland that your tears come from. These are sort of pipes leading down to what are referred to as your tear ducts. Some of the tears produced by your eye are actually drained through these ducts down here below the eye. But basal tears are going to exist so that you can regularly keep your eye moist. And the moisture on your eye does several things. It helps to keep particulate matter out. It provides sort of a protective film layer, sort of a mucousy fatty layer that protects the surface of your eye from different irritants. There are actually chemicals secreted in your basal tears that can kill bacteria. And so your immune system actually works through your basal tears. So again, basal tears, that's just the basic moisture. Like right now as I'm blinking my eyes and my eyes are getting a little bit moist, those are just basal tears. So then we also have tears that are called reflex tears. So I would imagine almost everybody has experienced reflex tears. Reflex tears are tears that come because of some kind of like acute irritation that's affecting your eye. So a really common example is chopping onions. When we chop onions, sulfur compound gases that are released from the chopping of the onion can irritate your eye. And in response to that, your eye is going to produce reflex tears. And, again, we tend to think of tears sort of as, it's just water pouring out of your lacrimal gland. And I guess it sort of intuitively makes sense that that water might act as a protective layer. But something that we probably don't think about all the time is that these tears literally contain chemicals that act as medicine. So in the case of reflex tears, you've got chemicals inside of reflex tears that are going to help to sort of remove and dilute those irritants, and that's exactly why you tear up in those situations. Other examples of situations that might cause you to reflex lacrimate would be things like if you got dirt or dust in your eye, or other kinds of like noxious gases that might be bothersome to you. So then that brings us to the last kind of tears, the kind that the question was asking about. When we talk about tears that come from sort of an emotional state, we refer to those as psychic tears. And the first two examples, basal tears and reflex tears, it's pretty easy to see why we need those, right? Like we have these eyeballs that are so useful, they allow us to see, and part of allowing us to see is that they're a little bit fragile, and so we need this sort of protective layer on the outside of them. But that sort of begs the question, like, what is the point of crying? And I wonder how many people have sort of had that thought maybe in the midst of being in an emotional state and really crying a lot and thinking to themselves, why do I even, like, why is part of this process a bunch of water pouring out of my eyes? But in fact, for the same reasons that we lacrimate in those other situations, we lacrimate when we have an emotional response. And the reason here is that, again, the tears, the lacrimal gland, again, that's the little blob over the eye. And something else that's kind of interesting is we don't often think that tears come from above the eye. It's, at least when I cry or when I tear up, I tend to think that it's coming almost from the inside, but the gland here toward the inner eye is something that drains the eyes. But again, the tears that come from psychic tears, from an emotional response tears, those contain several chemicals that can actually help to calm you down. And in fact, one of the chemicals that's contained in psychic tears is actually a painkiller. And so it's something that will sort of ease your emotional state, but also your physical state a little bit. And so crying is this physical response to something that's happened. And there is literally medicine in our tears that's supposed to help us with those kinds of situations. Now, of course, the types of emotional situations that humans go through are many and complex, and tears aren't always the solution. But how many times have you heard that somebody felt a lot better after having a good cry? And it's not just because they let a bunch of water out of their eyes, it's because they literally released medicine from inside their own body by crying. So sad science, but totally interesting science.
That is so cool. I had no idea.
Yeah, isn't that
That
fascinating?
makes so much sense why it feels good to cry then.
Yeah, right? I mean, it is, again, one of those things that we don't think about so often, but what an
Yeah.
amazingly neat thing that our body does for us.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Wow. Interesting.